Now that we know the t-curve exists, we want to know how to be able to find critical t-values so that we can do confidence interval questions later in this section. Now, critical t-values are going to be two t-values that have the same numerical value, but they're on opposite sides of 0, because 0 is the mean of a t-curve. And so because they're on those opposite sides, they'll have opposite signs, where one will be positive and one will be negative. Right? But there are two t-values, and that's what plus or minus stands for. There's two of them. One will be positive, one will be negative. All right, now alpha over 2, we don't want to overthink this too much. Your confidence level's in the middle, right? That's the area in the center. And then the two tails are both alpha over 2, and together they make alpha. So let me just note over here. Alpha is the area in both tails put together. Now, don't forget what we learned in section 9.1. That's very key, right? Recall, alpha and the sea level are complements, right? They add up to 1, right? That's what complements means. All right, now here we have the instructions for how we're going to do this, and we'll see that when we go do an example. But we're going to pick a different calculator than we've done before, the T calculator. We're going to click between, just like we did with the normal calculator. We're going to enter the degrees of freedom. That should just be one line, sorry about that. Enter the degrees of freedom, and then we're going to enter the sea level to the right of the equal sign down here. Now, degrees of freedom is n minus 1. We saw that in the definition on the previous page. All right, so let's do a couple examples. So we're going to determine the critical t-values in each of these cases, show an accurately shaded and labeled graph and all of the work. Okay, so let's begin. We're going to find the t-scores that correspond to a 95% confidence level, or confidence interval, same thing, for the mean when n equals 17. Okay, so if n equals 17, let's think about that for a second. The degrees of freedom is 17 take away 1, which would be 16. So that's our degrees of freedom. Okay, so now we're going to go to Stat Calculators T. So let me pull up StatCrunch. Here it is. I'm going to open StatCrunch by clicking the big yellow button. I've already signed in. So Stat Calculators T, right here. We're going to click between. Don't forget to do that. Change your degrees of freedom, this time at 16. We're going to go over here and start typing our confidence level. And when we do, the x values will disappear. So type in your confidence level of 0.95 and say compute. And there we have the values. So the value, let me write this line down. So probability of negative 2.1199 is less than or equal to well, in this case it's t, I know they're saying x, but which is less than or equal to 2.1199 equals 0.95. So the values that we were looking for are the plus and minus 2.1199. Now, you can write them like this. This is really the work that you use to find them, but it's much more common for us to write plus or minus t is plus or minus 2.1199. All right, now as for shading and labeling, we don't have to get too fancy about it. We just know that it needs to be symmetric in the middle. That middle should be 0.95. We have a negative t over here and a positive t over here. And if we want to label them, this is negative 2.1199 over here, positive 2.1199 over here. All done. But again, the actual numbers down there, you don't have to do that, but putting the negative t and the positive t. And if you want to put the little alpha over 2 in there just to be fancy, that's fine. Alpha over 2, by the way, is just a subscript that tells us that was the area in the tail. Don't worry about it. You don't have to calculate it. It's not a big thing for us. It's just a notation. All right, let's do it again. So now we have the critical t-values for a confidence interval if alpha is 0.005 and n is 35. Okay, well, if n is 35, the degrees of freedom is 35 take away 1, which is 34. All right, so we're going to keep that in mind. Now, when I want to go into StatCrunch, but the problem is that when I go to StatCrunch and I put in 34 right here for my degrees of freedom, over here I need to have my confidence level on the right, but I don't have the confidence, but I could find it, right? Because remember, alpha and the C level are complements. So since I have the alpha, I know that the C level would be 1 minus the alpha. So that would be 1 minus 0.005, which is 0.995. That's my confidence level. All right, so now I can go back to my StatCrunch. And I can say Stat Calculators T, right, which is where I'm at. I click between. I go over here. I make it 0.995, and I make the degrees of freedom 34, and I click Compute, and there we have it, plus or minus 3.002. I'm just writing it down. Okay, so let me write that line. There it is. Now the answers are actually the plus and minus 3.002. There's a positive value and a negative value for two critical t-values total. So the way we generally write that is plus or minus t alpha over 2 is plus or minus 3.002, like that. Now for labeling it, we want to shade a little bit more. This was only 0.95 shaded, so I want to shade more than that. I want to shade 0.995. So I'm going to shade more of my picture. This is negative t alpha over 2 over here. This is positive t alpha over 2 over here. And this is 0.995 in the middle. And there we go. That is how to find critical t values with StatCrunch.